Imagine we are standing at the arrivals gate. It is very early in the morning, and we are waiting for someone special. Let us just relax and watch together.
Early morning, the particular hush of an airport before it's fully woken up, a coffee cart just opening, a cleaning cart humming past, the arrivals board flipping over one more time. You're standing there, holding a small folded piece of paper in your pocket with a sentence written on it you've rehearsed so many times you don't actually need to read it anymore. Someone you haven't seen in 6 years is supposed to land in 11 minutes. Everyone watching would assume the obvious thing, a reunion, a love story. The kind of moment strangers in an airport stop to watch, quietly rooting for, without knowing anything about who's actually arriving. That wasn't it, not even close. And by the time the flight actually landed, he understood something about hope itself that he'd spent 6 years refusing to look at directly. I'll tell you what he understood, but first you should know who he was actually waiting for. I'm Clara. And this is a closure sen. Let's begin. His name doesn't matter for this one. What matters is a man standing at gate C14 at 6:40 in the morning, wearing a shirt he changed 3 times before leaving his apartment. Holding a coffee he wasn't actually drinking, just holding, the way you hold something to give your hands a job to do. He'd found out about the flight almost by accident. A cousin at a family gathering 2 weeks earlier mentioned offhand that your dad's finally talking about visiting sometime this year, the way you'd mention weather or traffic, something said without any awareness of the weight it would carry for the person hearing it. He'd asked, carefully, casually, when exactly. The cousin didn't know exactly. Just that there'd been talk. Just that a flight had maybe been looked at. Just that sometime this year had apparently at some point narrowed down to a specific date. Though nobody seemed entirely sure whether he seemed entirely sure whether that confirmed or just discussed. He'd spent the 2 weeks since then doing something he wasn't proud of. Checking flight arrivals from the city his father lived in, scanning for a name. A booking, anything. He found one. Eventually, a flight landing on a Tuesday morning, the timing loosely matching what his cousin had mentioned. He couldn't confirm his father was actually on it. There was no text, no call. No direct confirmation of any kind. Just a flight number, a departure city that matched, and 6 years of wanting to believe that this time the vague promise might actually mean something. He showed up anyway. He'd built an entire morning, an entire outfit, an entire rehearsed sentence around a piece of information he wasn't even sure was true. That's where he stood at 6:40 in the morning, watching the arrivals board. Waiting for a flight, and avoiding for a flight he wasn't certain his father was actually on, for a reunion he wasn't certain had ever really been promised in the first place. The estrangement hadn't started with one dramatic event. That's the part people rarely understand about family distance. It's rarely one explosive fight you can point to. It had started, slowly over years, the way most estrangements do. A difficult divorce when he was 14. A father who moved across the country for a job that somehow never quite led to moving back. Holidays that got smaller and smaller, then stopped happening at all. Phone calls that used to happen monthly, then a few times a year, then thinned into something closer to occasional, always with the same slightly too casual tone. As this scans, as if the growing distance itself could be smoothed over just by not mentioning it directly. Every conversation for the last several years had ended roughly the same way. His father, near the end of a call, would say something like, "I really need to come visit you sometime. It's been too long." And he would say, "Sure, that would be great. Let me know when." And nothing would come of it. No date, no follow-up, just the phrase itself repeated year after year. Functioning less like a real intention and more like a habit. A thing his father said the way other people say we should get coffee sometime, never actually expecting anyone to hold them to it. He'd stopped believing it years ago, mostly. There had been a period around 3 years back where he'd stopped bringing it up entirely, tired of the small disappointment that followed every unfulfilled mention. His silence on the topic hadn't been anger, exactly. More like a quiet form of self-protection, a decision to stop setting himself up for the same letdown on a loop. He'd rehearsed the opening line more times than he'd admit to anyone. Not something dramatic, just, "Hey, good flight." Casual enough to not put pressure on either of them, warm enough to signal that he wasn't still angry, even on the days he genuinely wasn't sure that was true. There's a particular kind of exhaustion in preparing carefully for a moment you're not even sure is going to happen. He'd thought about what he'd wear for 3 days beforehand, second-guessing a jacket that felt too formal, a t-shirt that felt too casual, eventually landing on something in between that he hoped read as effortless rather than as the 3 days of consideration it actually represented. He checked the arrivals board again. 9 minutes. He thought about the last time he'd actually seen his father in person. A wedding 2 years earlier, a cousin's wedding where they'd ended up at the same reception, technically together, mostly orbiting each other at a careful distance, exchanging maybe 15 minutes of actual conversation across an entire evening. His father had hugged him goodbye at the end of the night, held on a beat longer than usual, said, "We should really do this more often," in a voice that sounded, for just a second, like he almost meant it as more than a pleasantry. He'd driven home that night feeling something he didn't have a clean word for. Not quite hope. Something smaller and more cautious than hope. The kind of feeling you protect carefully because you already suspect somewhere underneath that it's not going to be rewarded. But the real moment, the one I mentioned at the beginning, hadn't happened yet. 7 minutes. He watched a woman nearby holding a Handmaid's Tale sign with a name on it, clearly waiting for someone specific, someone she was certain was actually arriving. He envied that certainty, briefly, sharply, before reminding himself that he didn't actually have any evidence his own wait would end the same way. He thought about texting his father directly, just to confirm a simple message. "Hey, are you flying in today? I could pick you up," and found himself unable to send it, the same way he'd been unable to send some version of that message for the past 2 weeks. If he asked directly and the answer was no, the fragile hope he was currently standing inside of would collapse immediately, cleanly, with no ambiguity left to hide inside. As long as he didn't ask, there was still a version of this morning where everything worked out. 5 minutes. He thought about all the other versions of this reunion he'd imagined over the years, back when he still let himself imagine it more freely. His father showing up unannounced at his door, some ordinary Tuesday, no warning, just there. A phone call where his father finally said plainly, without hedging, that he was sorry for the years of distance that he wanted to actually try, starting now. Standing across a train station once, in a half-asleep dream he'd had more than once. Watching his father simply look at him from a distance, neither of them moving first. He had never, in any of those imagined versions, pictured exactly this, standing at an arrival's gate on a piece of second-hand information, holding a coffee he wasn't drinking, hoping based on nothing more solid than a cousin's offhand comment and his own 6 years of wanting it to be true. 2 minutes. The flight showed as landed. He watched the doors. The way you watch a door when you've decided, consciously or not, that the next few minutes are going to determine something important about the rest of your day. He thought, briefly, about the version of this moment he might have imagined at 14, right after the divorce. Before he'd learned to expect less, that version of himself would have sprinted toward his father the second he saw him. No rehearsed line, no careful outfit, just pure uncomplicated relief. It struck him, standing there at 30. How much distance existed now between that 14-year-old and the man currently rehearsing a casual greeting like a hostage negotiator. Trying not to spook anyone, passengers began coming through. A businessman moving fast, phone already to his ear. A family with 2 small children, the mother visibly exhausted, the father wrangling too many bags, a group of college all-students loud and jet-lagged and delighted about something on someone's phone, an older couple moving slowly, holding hands. He watched each face carefully, the specific carefulness of someone scanning a crowd for one particular person. His heart doing things complicated and physical every time a tall man with graying hair came through the doors, followed immediately by the small, deflating recognition that it wasn't him. The flow of passengers thinned, then stopped almost entirely, down to the occasional straggler collecting a bag from an overhead bin, moving unhurried, clearly not rushing toward anyone waiting. He stood there for another 11 minutes after the last passenger came through. holding a coffee that had gone completely cold, watching a door that had stopped producing anyone at all. This was the moment, the one from the beginning. Not the estrangement itself, not the years of vague, almost promises. This, an empty arrival's gate, a coffee gone cold in his hand, and the sudden, complete understanding that he had built an entire morning around a sentence that had never actually been a real commitment. I should really come visit sometime had never been a plan. It had been a habit of speech, comfortable and empty, the verbal equivalent of we should get coffee sometime. Repeated so many times over so many years that some part of him had started treating it as a promise anyway, simply because he needed it to be one. He'd spent 6 years quietly measuring his own worth against how long it took his father to follow through on that sentence, as if the timelines had so were evidence of how much he mattered. Standing at that empty gate, he understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its bluntness, that the timeline had never actually been about him at all. It was about his father's own limitations, an avoidance of hard follow-through that likely showed up in other parts of his life too, unrelated to how much he loved his son. The sentence had simply been easier to say than to keep. Maybe you have your own version of that gate. Not necessarily an airport. Maybe it's a phone you've kept charged just in case, a door you still glance toward out of habit, a promise someone made so many times it started to feel solid. Even though nothing about it ever actually was, so much of hope is really just waiting for someone else to finally follow through on something they never fully intended to commit to. That's not a flaw in you for hoping. It's just what happens when you love someone whose words move faster than their actions ever do. Maybe you've noticed the same pattern show up in other relationships too, not just the original one. A tendency to give people the benefit of the doubt a little too long. To keep believing a repeated promise simply because it's been repeated so often it starts to feel true through sheer familiarity. That instinct isn't foolishness. It's usually just evidence of how much you value follow-through yourself, projected hopefully onto someone who's never quite operated the same way. I want you to hear something, and I want you to actually let it land, not just pass over you. You are not required to keep measuring your worth by how long it takes someone to show up for you. Their timeline was never actually a scorecard of your value. It was simply a reflection of their own capacity, or their own avoidance, or their own limitations, things that exist independently of you entirely. No matter how personally they land, you are allowed to release a promise that was never really a promise without deciding that hoping for it made you foolish. Hope isn't naive. It's simply what love does while it's waiting for evidence. If there's someone in your life who someday has stretched on for years without ever narrowing into an actual date, you're allowed to stop building your mornings, your outfits, your rehearsed sentences around a possibility that isn't theirs to keep offering indefinitely without ever following through. So here's what I'll leave you with tonight. He drove home that morning without ever getting a text, without ever getting an explanation, without ever fully knowing whether his father had even been on that flight to begin with, or whether the whole trip had been called off days earlier without anyone thinking to tell him. He never found out for certain, and somewhere on that drive home he realized he didn't need to find out to finally understand what he'd actually been waiting for all those years. Not a flight, not a date. Just permission to stop measuring himself against someone else's follow-through. You're allowed to give yourself that permission too, whenever you're ready. You don't need the flight to land. You don't need the explanation to arrive. You're allowed to simply, quietly, stop waiting at the gate. Let it be quiet now.